The glitz and glamour of Hollywood's golden age produced some of the most beloved stars of all time. However, not all of them were able to maintain their fortunes. Many famous actors and singers, once at the peak of their careers, ended up living in poverty, their legacies forgotten by the industry that once adored them. In today's video, we take a closer look at some of the most iconic stars who experienced a tragic fall from grace. During the 1930s through the 1950s, Hollywood was the land of dreams. Superstars were made overnight, and stardom came with millions of dollars. However, many of these actors and actresses were financially vulnerable due to the studio system. These stars had little control over their earnings, and as their careers faded, so did their wealth. Unlike modern-day celebrities, actors during this time were bound to long-term contracts with studios that dictated nearly every aspect of their careers. Salaries were fixed, and the actors had no control over their financial destinies. Many were exploited for their talent but received only a fraction of the revenue generated from their work. This system led many of them to bankruptcy as they spent their earnings too quickly, often with no knowledge of how to manage their finances. Here are a few of the most heartbreaking stories of Hollywood legends who saw their fame and fortune vanish. Ava Gardner, one of Hollywood's most iconic leading ladies, was the epitome of beauty and grace. Known for her sultry roles in films like The Killers and Mogambo, she was celebrated for her stunning looks and undeniable talent. Yet, despite being one of the most sought-after actresses of her time, Gardner's personal life was filled with turmoil. She had tumultuous marriages to Frank Sinatra and Artie Shaw, as well as a long history of alcoholism that eroded her health and career. By the 1960s, her star had faded, and she became increasingly isolated. Gardner spent her final years in relative obscurity, living in a small London apartment. Despite her past fortune, she had little to show for it, and by the time of her death in 1990, she had spent almost all her money. She died a reclusive figure, forgotten by the very industry that had once adored her. Erol Flynn was the quintessential Hollywood heartthrob, famous for his roles in films like Captain Blood and The Adventures of Robin Hood. With his matinee idol looks and athletic performances, he became the face of swashbuckling adventure in the 1930s and 1940s. However, Flynn's off-screen life was filled with scandals, excessive drinking, and a penchant for lavish living. Despite earning millions from his films, Flynn's extravagant lifestyle, coupled with his failed business ventures and poor investments, left him financially crippled. His later years saw him taking on low-paying roles in B-movies and living in a modest home in his final years. By the time of his death in 1959, Flynn had squandered much of his wealth, leaving him broke and forgotten by the Hollywood elite he had once dominated. Clara Bow, one of the brightest stars of the silent film era, was known as the It Girl, thanks to her magnetic personality and stunning beauty. Her role in the 1927 silent film, it made her an international sensation. Bow's career flourished during the 1920s, and she was one of the highest-paid actresses in Hollywood. But the arrival of sound films marked the beginning of her downfall. Clara Bow struggled to transition into talkies, and her career faltered as a result. Personal scandals, including a failed marriage, mental health issues, and financial mismanagement, took their toll on her career. By the time Bow died in 1965, she was living in near poverty, isolated from the Hollywood world. Despite her immense talent and fame, her legacy had been largely erased, and she spent her final years in obscurity. Edward G. Robinson, known for his roles in gangster films such as Little Caesar and Key Largo, was one of the most respected actors of his time. Robinson was at the top of his game in the 1930s and 1940s, earning millions and becoming synonymous with tough guy roles. But the 1950s saw his career take a drastic turn. Robinson was blacklisted during the McCarthy era for his alleged communist sympathies, which caused him to lose out on several lucrative roles. His career never fully recovered, and his financial situation worsened. By the time of his death in 1973, Robinson was living in relative obscurity. Despite his illustrious career and wealth at one point, he passed away with little money, largely forgotten by the industry that once celebrated him. Theda Bera, known as the original vamp, was one of the first stars to gain international fame in the silent film era. Her role in Cleopatra made her a sensation, and she quickly became one of Hollywood's most sought-after actresses. But Bera's career came to an abrupt halt with the advent of sound films, and she struggled to find work in the talkies era. Though she had been one of the highest-paid actresses of her time, Bera's financial situation deteriorated over the years. She made poor investments, and as the film industry changed, she was unable to maintain her star power by the time of her death. In 1955, Bera had little money and was living in obscurity. She had been forgotten by the public and the industry that had once adored her. Peg Entwistle's story is one of the most tragic in Hollywood history. Entwistle appeared in just one film, 13 Women, 1932, but her career never took off. She struggled to find success in Hollywood, facing rejection after rejection. Her mental health deteriorated, and in a moment of despair, she took her own life in 1932 by jumping from the famous Hollywood sign. Despite her brief time in the industry, Entwistle was plagued by financial difficulties and the pressures of a career that never materialized. Her tragic death shocked the Hollywood community, and she remains one of the most poignant examples of a starlet who never saw the fame she so desperately sought. William Haines was one of the top stars of the 1920s and 1930s, known for his roles in films like The Snob and Tell It to the Marines. He was beloved for his charm and likability, becoming one of Hollywood's most popular actors. However, Haines was also one of the first major stars to be openly gay in an industry that demanded conformity, and Haines refused to hide his sexuality. MGM, his studio, dropped him. His career ended abruptly, and he struggled to find work. Despite his past fame, Haines was never able to regain his financial footing. He spent his later years working as an interior designer, but his finances remained tight. He died in 1973, largely forgotten by the public and with little to show for his once glittering career. Buster Keaton, one of the most legendary comedians of the silent film era, was known for his incredible physical comedy and stoic expression. Films like The General and Sherlock Jr. remain iconic examples of Keaton's unique genius. However, as the film industry transitioned to sound, Keaton's career faltered. His style didn't translate well to the new format, and he struggled to find work. In addition to his professional setbacks, Keaton struggled with alcoholism and personal turmoil. His finances suffered, and by the time he died in 1966, Keaton was living in relative poverty. Despite being regarded as one of the greatest comedic actors of all time, Keaton's final years were marked by financial instability and obscurity. Marylin Monroe, the most famous sex symbol of the 1950s, had a life as tragic as it was glamorous. With iconic films like Some Like It Hot and Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, Monroe was the ultimate symbol of Hollywood beauty and sensuality. But beneath the public persona, Monroe struggled with mental health issues, substance abuse, and failed marriages. Despite earning millions during her career, Monroe's financial situation was precarious. She was often manipulated by those around her, including her managers and agents, who mismanaged her earnings. After her death in 1962, her estate was left in disarray, and much of her wealth was not properly handled. Her legacy, however, remains one of the most iconic in Hollywood history, even if she never fully benefited from it. Jean Harlow, known as the original blonde bombshell, was one of the most popular stars of the 1930s. Her films like Red Dust and Hell's Angels made her a household name, and her beauty and charisma were unparalleled. However, Harlow's life was tragically cut short when she died of kidney failure in 1937 at the age of just 26. Although she had earned millions during her career, much of Harlow's wealth was mismanaged by her mother and stepfather. The financial mismanagement, along with her premature death, meant that Harlow was not financially secure at the time of her passing. She was buried in a simple grave, her fortune gone, and her career tragically short-lived. Dorothy Lamour was a beloved actress in the 1930s and 1940s, best known for her role in The Hurricane, 1937, and for popularizing the iconic sarong look. Lamour became a favorite of moviegoers with her exotic beauty and charm, landing roles in a string of successful films. She was particularly well known for her appearances in adventure films set in tropical locales such as The Hurricane and Disputed Passage, 1939, making her one of the most glamorous stars of the era. However, as the 1950s approached, Lamour's popularity waned as film styles changed, and she found herself relegated to less substantial roles. Her finances were mismanaged, and although she earned a substantial amount during her peak years, Lamour died with very little to show for her fame. She lived her final years in near poverty, struggling to maintain her lifestyle after being forgotten by Hollywood. Lana Turner, one of the most iconic stars of Hollywood's golden age, captured the public's attention with her roles in films such as The Postman Always Rings Twice, 1946, and Payton Place, 1957. Turner was known for her stunning beauty and as the quintessential femme fatale in noir films. Despite her fame, her personal life was plagued with scandals, including tumultuous marriages, an infamous affair with mobster Johnny Stompanato, whose violent death in 1958 was one of the most publicized incidents in Hollywood, and the tragic death of her daughter, Cheryl Crane, who killed her mother's abusive boyfriend in self-defense. By the end of her career, Turner was no longer a top box office draw, and her fortune dwindled. Although she remained a star, her declining roles and financial mismanagement contributed to her financial ruin. She lived her final years in obscurity, dying in 1995 with very little left from her once glamorous career. Jean Arthur was known for her distinct voice and comic timing, becoming one of the best-known stars of screwball comedies. Films like Mr. Deeds Goes to Town, 1936, and The More the Merrier, 1943, showcased her charm, wit, and versatility. At the height of her career, Jean Arthur was in demand by the biggest studios, but after years of stardom, she became increasingly disillusioned with the industry. She famously walked away from Hollywood in the mid-1940s, finding the pressures of fame and the studio system too overwhelming. Despite offers of lucrative roles, she left the film business behind for a quieter life. Arthur's decision to step away from the spotlight meant that she was financially unprepared for her later years. By the time of her death in 1976, she had been largely forgotten by Hollywood, living with very little from her storied past. John Gilbert was one of the biggest heartthrobs of the silent film era, best known for his performances in films such as The Big Parade, 1925, and The Merry Widow, 1925. His sultry looks and deep voice made him a leading man for many years. However, his transition from silent films to talkies was not as successful as some of his contemporaries. Critics mocked his voice, and he struggled to adapt to the changing tastes of the public. Gilbert's career began to unravel as his star faded, and he became known more for his personal troubles than for his films. He was financially irresponsible, and his lavish lifestyle drained his fortune. By the time of his death in 1936, he was in a state of financial ruin, and his passing was largely overshadowed by the rising stars of the sound era. Gloria Grahame was a stunning actress who made a name for herself in the 1940s and 1950s with her roles in films such as The Big Heat, 1953, and Oklahoma, 1955. She was known for her sultry allure and captivating presence in noir films. Despite her success, Graham's personal life was filled with scandal, including multiple marriages, one of which involved an inappropriate relationship with her teenage stepson, leading to a public fallout. Graham's career was never able to fully recover from these scandals, and as a result, she was often relegated to smaller roles later in life. By the time of her death in 1981, Grahame had become largely forgotten by the public and had very little left of the fortune she once had. Bette Davis was a towering figure in Hollywood, known for her powerful performances in films such as All About Eve, 1950, and Jezebel, 1938. She was one of the most respected actresses of her time, garnering multiple Academy Awards throughout her career. However, as her career slowed in the 1960s, Davis faced financial difficulties. Her bitter feud with Joan Crawford and declining health made it difficult for her to land major roles, and her fortune slowly dwindled. Davis was financially mismanaged, and though she had once been a beloved icon, she died in 1989 alone and largely forgotten by Hollywood. Her death marked the end of an era for the once reigning Queen of Tinseltown. Zasu Pitts was a beloved comedic actress during the 1920s and 1930s, often paired with the likes of W.C. Fields in films such as The Cat's Meow, 1929, and The Party's Over, 1934. Pitts was known for her unique sense of humor and quirky personality, which endeared her to audiences. However, as the film industry evolved, Pitts found herself being pushed to the sidelines. Her later years were marked by limited roles, and she became less of a household name. By the time of her death in 1963, Pitts was struggling financially, with little to show for her years of work in the industry. Barbara Payton's brief Hollywood career is a tragic tale of fame, beauty, and decline. Known for her roles in films such as Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye, 1950, Payton was considered one of the most promising actresses of her time. Her striking looks and talent garnered her attention, but her inability to navigate the pressures of Hollywood, as well as her tumultuous personal life, including relationships with several high-profile men, left her struggling. After her fall from grace, Payton was unable to find meaningful work, and by the 1960s she had completely faded from the public eye. She spent her last years in poverty, and when she passed away in 1967, she had little to her name except for a few personal belongings. These stars, once beloved by millions, experienced the cruel ebb and flow of fame and fortune, and their stories are a haunting reminder of the volatile nature of Hollywood and the impact it had on many of its brightest stars. Despite their significant contributions to the entertainment industry, they were often left to struggle in the shadows, forgotten by the very industry that had once made them icons.